Let's bring in Harry Verhoeven at Columbia University in New York. Harry, good to see you. You know, this ceasefire that has been broken multiple times by both sides, not really a ceasefire at all.
Not real ceasefire at all, and not very surprising, unfortunately. As has been clear since the outbreak of conflict now almost 3 weeks ago, both sides really believe that the stakes of this conflict are existential, that they both represent the true voice of important constituencies among the Sudanese people, and that only with a full victory of their cause can the unity of the country and of their respective institutions be preserved. And so, whilst there's a lot of international pressure for ceasefires to allow humanitarian aid in, to allow people to leave the country, in reality, these parties are not committed to peace or any kind of political solution. They want a military victory.
You know, what choice really did the military government have, though? When this fighting started, it would have been yet another coup, correct?
Well, it's difficult to say what exactly was happening, and I think historians will have have their job cut out for them to document in months and years to come what exactly the events were that led to the outbreak of violence about 3 weeks ago. But it's certainly clear that a military confrontation between the RSF and the Sudan Armed Forces was kind of written in the stars. I mean, we've seen this coming for years, the buildup of tensions, the feelings, especially in the Sudan Armed Forces, that the RSF had to be taken down a notch, that it was not acceptable for the army or for the state that you have this very powerful paramilitary force, which has its own economic resources, conducting its own diplomacy, engaging with political institutions in its own way, sometimes independent of what the army thought. And so, in that sense, a confrontation was very much to be foreseen. What I think is the real problem is that external actors, and especially external diplomats, did not take seriously enough for many months and many years the scenario of this confrontation happening, despite warnings to that effect, and despite that previous transitions in Sudan after the revolution and after the collapse of an authoritarian government had essentially failed on exactly this point. And so failing to learn those lessons from the 1960s and from the 1980s, in that sense, is what brought us to this point and to this very desperate situation that we're now seeing unfold.
I guess one could say that at least the two sides have agreed to a ceasefire in the last few days, even though that ceasefire has not held. But where do you see this going? How long do you think this fighting could last?
Well, that's entirely up to how well resourced the parties are. It's very difficult, again, to have a good sense of how easy both parties are finding it to get supplies of food, of medication, of ammunition to their soldiers on the front lines. The RSF has been continuously underestimated. People have very often dismissed it as some kind of tribal militia that would be crushed in just a couple of days. It's very clear that this is not the case. Even if they would be dislodged from their positions in central Khartoum, where a lot of the bombing has been happening in the past couple of days, there is a real chance that they might retreat to Darfur, which is where most of the fighters and most of the senior RSF leadership hails from. And they could potentially start an insurgency from there. And in many cases, there's a lot of reason to assume that they'd be quite successful potentially at doing so, especially if they would get support from one or other regional parties. So in that sense, there's a real risk of this kind of escalating regional conflict, which would be profoundly destabilizing, not just for Sudan, but for all the neighboring countries. But that will in part be dictated, as I said, by the capabilities of the RSF, which have so far exceeded what many people have thought possible.
All right, Harry, good to talk to you. Thanks much.